Okay, everybody. Kind of picking up where we left off for this lecture, we're going to talk about supporting liberal democracies. There are situations where liberal democracies can use traditional themes and effectiveness to support demanding forms of government. This is obvious in constitutional monarchs. The examples that the book talks about will be Britain, Japan, Denmark, and Spain. These elected leaders will have political authority. Monarchs more are on the level of personifying national tradition, ritual, and pride. We had a little bit of a discussion about that in class about the English monarch, the UK monarch. When we don't have a monarch, we also use traditional themes as well. Respecting the flag, which was a whole issue coming up ever since Colin Kaepernick decided to kneel during the national anthem. And it goes all the way back. There was a gentleman named Mahmoud Abdul Rauf who used to play basketball, and he would sit during the national anthem, which kind of became a big deal. I think he played for Atlanta Hawks. I'm not quite sure. But his real name was Chris Jackson, or his given name was Chris Jackson, and he changed it when he converted to Islam. We also have, like I said, anthems and parades, which was a big kind of a big issue with some of the rhetoric coming from the Trump administration about having parades and militaristic show of force. Leaders traditional also have kind of that nationalistic type of rhetoric where, we talked about one culture, one language, one country. And some of these, are most stable when liberal democracies are rich. One thing to kind of put any type of government in danger is when people are poor or when people don't have money. Usually, if people are stable with their income, they'll consent to the government more. And with liberal democracies, they're rich. Education, healthcare, quality of life indicators such as mortality rates that are going up here in the United States, or, infant mortality rates, which are going down. So we're getting older as a country, but then we also have a sense that we're able to take care of children, our babies, through the prenatal care and certain things that are available to our government and to our people. So we talk about illiberal democracies. We have roughly 70 countries that hold regular elections, but aren't true liberal democracies. These are situations where the leaders might not accept their defeat. Maybe not respecting the rights of the citizens, and maybe considered failing liberal democracies because they claim to have values that are open to rights and civil liberties, but it's not really true. Right? They try to imitate the democratic model, but they don't really go through and enforce the democratic model. These countries imitate only part of the democratic model. Examples may be like Singapore, Turkey, Russia. And, kind of the thought in this is the leaders believe that the effectiveness should trump liberal rights. So leaders argue that government can deliver stability and economic growth more effectively when they focus less on civil rights. Leaders may act in an authoritarian way. In some countries, some of these voters might actually prefer to be in a dictatorship and an authoritarian government. Some of the examples, like we talked about, might be in the Muslim world where they're based off of Sharia law, right? Some of these core rationales in managing democracy are, we have too much insistence on there's too much insistence on fair process and impedes effective results. Every citizen of liberal democracies kind of have a blanket agreement that governments are ineffective. This may suspend parts of normal processes in case of war, natural disasters, and sometimes rights can lead to maddening results, such as obviously guilty criminals being acquitted just on the standard that we have here in the United States with crime and punishment. In order to be convicted of a crime, you have to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And sometimes people who are obviously guilty get off because some of these attorneys can raise reasonable doubt. We also have things where parties might not get along with each other. It might not get along within the party. There's party strife that could happen. Electoral campaigns distract leaders from addressing policy issues. Remember, we talked about that last semester, where people that are running for office tend to be ambiguous in their party policy platform decisions because they don't want to alienate people. Illiberal democracies based on this criticism might be Putin in Russia and Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. Illiberal democracy also promises effective results with some semblance of that democratic process. But a lot of these illiberal democracies will fail to provide strong results, and they become authoritarian and hypocritical, right? Saying that we have a fair society, a open society, but not really acting on it. And the book talks about Singapore as being one of these. You have democratic rhetoric as well. Authoritarian actions that are in Russia, they slide into democracy, to hypocrisy. Russia is the most prominent case, but we also have issues that happen in Pakistan, Nigeria, Haiti, and Iraq. Putin keeps getting reelected. How? It's weird. I mean, his economy benefited the super rich, and now Russia is one of the most corrupt countries. He eliminated competition. Sometimes the opposition was sued, beaten, maybe, taking an envelope or being paid off. And he uses that tough guy image and plays up nationalism within that society that he runs. And, these true authoritarian regimes don't bother claiming popular support. They just take it. There's Putin, the classic picture of Putin on the horse with his shirt off. That's one of the more, the funnier pictures that I've seen. That's a nice looking horse, though. We also have some success. Singapore's kind of had illiberal success. They have effective results, elements of law and a fair process, an elected government that allows little competition. Today, Singapore is one of the financial centers of Southeast Asia and the third richest population in the world. And, there's been stories about, when I was a kid, there was a kid, I believe his name was Michael Fay, and he vandalized some cars in Singapore, right? And as part of his punishment is he had to be caned. So he was hit with a Singapore cane a few times, and that's kind of the way they dole out their punishment. And there's videos on it, and it's a really, really kind of disturbing thing to see where people get whacked with canes, and it looks like it doesn't hurt, but it sounds like it hurts, because if you ever seen somebody be hit with a Singapore cane, there are definitely welts that will be brought up. In Singapore, the Constitution allows governments to suspend rights as necessary. Lifestyle restrictions. Critics that are part of the media are suppressed. In about 30 countries, social and religious tradition opposes rights and representations. A majority might also choose that type of authoritarian rule that we talked about. These leaders will look at, limiting rights is the only way to preserve liberty and positive social change. So it's kind of contrary to what we think here in the United States, when we've been kind of conditioned to believe that, our government will work more effectively if we have rights that are protected. It's kind of the opposite in these countries, where they think that suppressing rights will give people more individual liberty and a positive social change. Now, when we talk about the Muslim world, some of these Muslim worlds are based off of Sharia law, where is teachings of the Quran that and clerics are used to, in a sense, govern people. There's a suspicion of Western ideas and some of the criticisms that come out of the really radical Muslim world. Modernizing elites aligned with Western governments argued that limiting rights was necessary to prevent Islamic takeover. Egypt, is an example. The United States supported Mubarak's illegal regime, and the regime was brought down in the 2011 Arab Spring. We had free elections in 2012 that gave the majority to the Muslim Brotherhood. And as a part of that, Morsi's government out of the Muslim Brotherhood was accused of suppressing rivals and critical press. As a result, we had another violent takeover where a general won the 2014 election with 96% of the vote. That number kind of stands out, doesn't it? 96% of the vote. That's weird. I mean, just kind of, I don't think it takes an expert on Egyptian politics to understand that 96% is really concerning as far as, giving legitimacy to a government. When we talk about authoritarians, these are leaders that do not pretend to respect individual rights or legal processes. We know about Kim Jong-un in North Korea. That's a good example of an authoritarian leader. They tend to justify that authoritarianism by using traditional or charismatic principles. Having that charismatic leader talk to you, trying to get you invested in the country, right? And with that totalitarian regime, they try to control every single aspect of citizens' lives. And, like I said, that's something that's kind of foreign to us here in the United States. And the book talks about examples like Nazi Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, and Mao Zedong in China. Right? Today, only North Korea comes close to qualifying as totalitarian. I would also argue Cuba is a little bit like that too, even though, we've seen less and less restrictions in Cuba as before. We have monarchies, which are hereditary rulers, often with some divine endorsement. That whole divine right of kings that we've learned about in history, right? There's also possibilities where, it might be the least powerful form of authoritarianism. Monarchs claim absolute power in only 6 countries, and most are supported by oil wealth. And we've kind of gone away from that divine right of kings. Now, theocracy, or kind of the study of religion, or the basis of religion, or the ideology of using a religion in your governing. It actually makes religion the leading principle of government is not actually traditional. Iran is the only quasi-theocracy today. They have the Ayatollah who claims unlimited power to correct political decisions. They rely on that charismatic legitimacy, getting people to do something, getting people to motivating people to coalesce and come together for the betterment of the country. Iran is an unstable country on our view, but in their view, they may be pretty stable because they submit to what their leader wants them to do or what the Ayatollah wants them to do. And it's all based off of Sharia law. We also have one-party regimes. This is like China that we talked about. In China, we had an election a few years ago, and, the party that was running won most of the votes. Right, I think it was 95%. Some of the examples of one-party regimes are China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, and Laos. They're all originally kind of built off of that communist ideology that we talked about. We saw in the 1920s and the 1930s, that one-party regime developing in Germany and Italy following that model. And these regimes have broad organizational basis, indoctrination, success depends on people taking your message and acting on it. And, a lot of maybe propaganda or stuff that comes into play where we are indoctrinated with ideology or like I said, rhetoric to make us do something. And that also kind of make cloud up our original form of an ideology when we put this into practice. Now, we have dictatorships, which are the least principal form of authoritarianism, right? Charismatic leader with nationalistic themes. Hitler is the perfect example. Somebody that was able to get a group of people together to create atrocities and have them believe in them, based off of that nationalistic point of view. Blaming the Jewish people on a lot of Germany's problems and kind of framing them as evil, and then we saw what happened, the atrocities that happened in World War II. This claim is mostly based off of effectiveness. Claims country will be overwhelmed by problems otherwise, like we saw in 1930s Germany, or al-Assad's regime in Syria most recently. We have this happen when there's points of instability in a nation or there's economic problems, and usually a military leader or the military general will take over. Many eventually seek some type of legitimacy in elections, and we saw that. Fiji qualifies. We'll talk more about that when we get together. Most authoritarian regimes have a deep descent into hypocrisy than illiberal democracies. China has greater inequality than the U.S. despite its socialistic ideas. And we'll look at inequality in a bit when we get to talking about development. That'll probably be after our spring break. Now, a lot of these people depend on something called what we talked about, the cult of personality, where you have propaganda and a personal worship. We talked about Trump having that cult of personality, Obama having the cult of personality, maybe Sanders having it. All these people that can get people together for a movement, right? The Assad's in Syria. We have giant portraits all over Syria, and kind of the boasting that the government is the best and stuff like that. Some of these regimes also provide some services to citizens. One of the exceptions is a kleptocracy. And let's take a look at that word, right? Kleptocracy. If we look at that word, let's look at the root. Klepto. When we hear the word klepto, what does that mean? That means somebody that steals, right? So the book uses the example of Mobutu Seko in the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where a lot of the country's resources were pilfered by the government. So here is a kind of a graph of liberal democracies, illiberal democracies, and the different types of governments that we talked about: authoritarianism, monarchy, theocracy, one-party regime, and dictatorship. So some of these liberal democracies commit to a demanding logical formula rather than leaving the leaders free to act. Liberal democracies try to maximize individual freedom, which we see here in the United States, tries to limit government actions to those necessary to protect citizens and protect basic opportunities. We all know that's the reason the Bill of Rights was put into place in 1791 here in the United States, so it can protect the government, and it can also protect the people from the government. Right? So the government can infringe on our rights. Leaders are held accountable through elections. Remember we talked about that retrospective voting in class a couple of last semester, where people vote based off of how they have experienced the previous party in the past 4 years. Retrospectively voting. And also this kind of the system that we have encourages compromise, even though we don't really see it at times. We are expected to kind of use that view of compromise in trying to pass laws and also trying to protect citizens and what those rights should be. We also have fascism, right? And this is a complete rejection of liberal democracy, where individual rights are undesirable. People find meaning only as part of a nation. Liberal democracy's freedom actually dupes people into pursuing meaningless self-interest rather than serving the greater cause. So it's talk like this, the government believes that the government is the ultimate all power in the universe, and that if we as individuals want to seek our own self-satisfaction, we are doing harm to the country. Marxism is another kind of a view that liberal democracy protects the wrong rights. Liberal democracy protects the rich, which we talked about. Political rights don't matter when the rich control elections and policy. And economic rights are the rights that matter. Kind of that classism. We all need to be equal economically. And then we have radical Islam, like I talked about. Sharia law produces a more modest, respectful society. So also some of the criticisms that we have of liberal democracy is that money plays so much of an issue here, especially in the U.S. The wealthy can influence elections, by better legal counsel. Remember when we talked about there's instances where people who are obviously guilty are found not guilty in elections. I don't like to say innocent because there's some times people can be found not guilty, but they're not innocent. I don't know if that makes sense or not. When people are found not guilty, but they might not be innocent. I know, the O.J. Simpson thing is probably one of the good examples of that. Modern liberals will believe that governments must act to ensure that disadvantaged citizens are not excluded from the benefits of liberty. Conservatives are these modern conservatives believe that government should draw on religious values to promote morality. That adherence to tradition and order. And they're concerned about expansion of rights, for abortion, gay rights, feminism, and so on. So we'll go ahead and stop here. There is some things that you can look at. These are the material explanations that the book has. And when we come back on the next week, we'll talk more and more about some of these things and we'll review for the exam. Okay, guys, we'll see you soon.